So I'm gonna do what they tell you never to do, which is to start a shir with an apology, but I'm gonna do it anyway. At the end of the shir last week, we sort of got caught up in a start of a second topic, which was really unfair of me because I realized very quickly that we weren't going to finish it. So I apologize for that. It just means that there's going to be an extra need for an extra shear in this series. We're not going to finish it before Shavuot, but we'll hopefully get there. To all of the Israelis on the call, Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach. I am quite impressed that you took time away from your barbecues to join us. Thank you very much, and we're jumping in.
It's RV time. Barbecues are during the day.
Yes. Okay. I hear that. It's
My husband went off to shul for RV.
There you go. Okay, so it's Motzei Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach. Okay. We're still at 8 hours before you, so I hear that. Okay, let's jump in. Last week we talked, actually well, it doesn't matter. Last week we talked about the tragedy of the death of Elimelech and his two sons, and the sense that this is happening as a kind of retribution or a kind of punishment for the chait of leaving the land of Israel and going abroad or to the land of Moab because of the famine in the land of Israel itself. And we talked, actually, I'm going to pull up. I wasn't planning to do that, but let's do it anyway. I'm going to pull up the last week's source page for a moment. The source page that I will share in a moment with you is today's source page, which is a little different, but I'm just going to pull up last week's for a moment because this opening series this is the psukim at the beginning of the Sefer, and somebody asked me a relevant question. I'm going to repeat it here. I didn't really address the question of what the significance of this chiasm or chiastic structure is, but you can see right away from the words that I've highlighted that there is a certain kind of structure to the opening psukim. There's a famine in the land, and a man from Beit Lechem goes to the land of Moab together with his family. Then in Pasuk Bet, we're introduced to the family, Elimelech, Naomi, Machlon, Michayon, and they stay in Moab. Then Elimelech dies in Moab, and Naomi is left. Then the children marry two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, and they're there for 10 years. Then Machlon and Chilion die, and so you see already that Pasuk Hey, with the death of Machlon and Chilion, and the tragedy for Naomi in Pasuk Hey, what I've labeled C, parallels the death of Elimelech in C1, and then in Pasuk Vav, parallel to Elimelech and his family staying in the fields of Moab, it says that she decides to return from the fields of Moab, Vatashov Misnei Moab. And then back to 1, or A, which is that the famine in the land, and they went to Beit Lechem, they hear that there is bread in the land, in parallel to the famine. So you can see that there's a very structured chiasmus to these psukim, and typically what a purpose of a chiasmus in Tanakh does is it highlights the center pillar, and that would not be a surprise to us because the central pillar or pasuk of this structure is the introduction to us of Orpah and Ruth. And Ruth really is the central motif of the main persona of the whole book. So, and it also gives us a chronology that they were there for 10 years, which we'll see what the significance of that in a moment. So I think that that's interesting too, that the very opening of the structure tells us, there's a tragedy surrounding all of this, but like the survivor out of that tragedy emerges not just Naomi, but also Ruth, and Ruth becomes the main persona in the rest of the story. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that by completing the chiasmus here in Pasuk Vav, what it tells me is that the whole section of the first chapter that deals with going to Moab, marrying the wives, the tragedy of the death of Elimelech and his two sons, and her return. All of that is the introduction to the book. And the moment this book really starts, or the story starts, when Naomi and Ruth begin their journey home. And so it's in this introduction, which is a single unit, a complete unit, in which we find the story of the tragedy of Elimelech and his sons, and that's really what I want to continue to pick up on. We had spent some time talking last week, talking about the famine and the fact that from the famine they left Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab, and we talked about the significance of leaving the land of Israel and the way Chazal describe it, which is the disappointment, the disheartening of the people of Israel, because here is the leader of the community, Elimelech, and at a time of great need, at a time of great distress, they pick themselves up and abandon their family in Israel and move to Moab. And that's sort of where we left off. We also traced the triangle of Lot and his daughters, the birth of Moab, and Yehudah and Tamar and the birth of Peretz. Both of those stories are referenced in the book itself. Ruth, who comes from Moab, and Tamar and Yehudah are referenced at the end of the Sefer. That lineage will come back to, that triangle will come back to much later in our study of the book. But for now, that was where we left off, and we ended up with a question. Although we started to try to address it, we're going to review that now. But we ended up with a question, and that question has to do with the introduction of the Sefer. So let's just go back to here, the beginning of the Sefer. V'hi b'mei shvot hashoftim, v'hi ra'av ba'aretz, v'elech ish min Bethlehem Yehudah lagur b'sdei Moav. The notion that there is in the days of the Shoftim, so we're dealing with the time period of the book of Shoftim. The time period of the book of Shoftim is more or less 400 years, so that doesn't really help us pinpoint much. V'hi ra'av ba'aretz. There's a famine in the land. Unfortunately, in the book of Shoftim, we don't find anywhere any reference to a ra'av, and so we're left with the question of when this story happens. But the notion of leaving the land of Israel to go to Moab because there's a famine in the land leaves us with a little bit of a challenge, because meteorologically and topography-wise, it's hard to understand, and we're just pulling up this map, it's hard to understand how from Bethlehem, Yehudah, which is here, when there's a famine and a drought and no bread and no food and no rain, why going to Moab, which is just on the other side of the Dead Sea, why would there be any more rain in Moab than there is in Bethlehem? It's a hard argument to make. The climate region of Israel and the plains of Moab are not that different. Very hard to imagine or understand that there would be rain in Moab, but not in Bethlehem. Somebody asked me the question last week about at the end of this year, about the Reuven and Gad, who make the argument that their land is a land of grazing land, and they want to stay there because it's grazing land. But that's true with the whole land of Israel, meaning that's true if there's rain. If there's rain, there's grazing land, so great, right? But if there's no rain, you go south to Egypt, to the Nile. Going to Moab doesn't help us in any way. There's no rain. There's no rain in Israel. There's no rain in Reuven and Gad. There's no rain in Moab. This is one region climate-wise. Very hard to understand why this famine would lead to going to Moab. That's the question. I threw it out there. If you agree with the question, great. If you don't agree with the question, that's also okay. I'm going to take it as a given. And from here, we're going to start an exploration of the historical context of the book of Shoftim. As last week, I dealt with it in a vacuum, right? Void of any historicity. But that's not really fair. We need to kind of jump into the historical context. When is the story taking place? If the Navi says, "V'hi b'mei shvot hashoftim," in the days of the judges, meaning this is somewhere in the context of the book of Shoftim, chronologically, then that seems to tell me there's something significant. So that's where we're going to pick up today. I dropped a couple of pieces of information last week. I'm going to redo it all, and we're going to start from here. Okay, somebody had a question just a moment ago. Is there a question that somebody wanted to? No? Okay. So let me throw the source page into the chat for you, because we're going to need it. And if I can just trouble somebody to keep an eye on this, if anybody joins and says, "Can I have a copy of the source page?" Just keep the chat open. I've closed the chat because I have more screen real estate that way. We'll come to it at the end. All right. So to identify more or less when this story took place, we're going to have to do, forgive me, we're going to have to do a bird's eye review of the entire period of the Book of Shoftim. So hold on to your seats, because this is going to take us on a journey of about 350 years or so. We're going to review the context of the Book of Shoftim. Chazal do this in a unique way, and Midrashim typically, instead of hitting the issues directly, will kind of go about them roundabout by leaving breadcrumbs of hints. That's typically Chazal style. And so Chazal do this in two ways. Number one, they pick up on the phrase Shvot HaShoftim. The text could have just as easily, sorry about that, wrong one. Text could have just as easily have said Vahi b'mei HaShoftim. Right? Shvot HaShoftim sounds a little flowery. In the days of the judging judges, or judges judged, or what exactly that means. And then there is a famine, and we have this leader, this person from Bethlehem, Yehuda. So Chazal do two things. They, number one, try to identify what Shvot HaShoftim means, and number two, to try to identify Boaz, because Boaz is never mentioned in the Book of Shoftim. And if I have a story that's contemporary to the Book of Shoftim, and I have an individual in Bethlehem of significance and stature and power in the persona of Boaz, that he's not mentioned anywhere in Sefer Shoftim is odd. And so Chazal don't like to leave those anonymous ambiguities open, and they will pinpoint and suggest to us who Boaz is. So we're going to take these two issues one at a time. The first is the phrase Vahi b'mei Shvot HaShoftim. Here, Chazal make the following statement. Amar of Yochanan, Mai dichti Vahi b'mei Shvot HaShoftim. What is the meaning of the phrase? It was in the days of the, technically, Shvot HaShoftim means the judging of the judges. It says, the Gemara Dor sheshofet et shoftav. It's a reflection of the generation. It's a generation not just where you had leaders called shoftim, but where the judges themselves were judged by others. Meaning, if you want to describe a generation in which the leadership was not of high moral character, where the leadership had much to be desired, then the description is it's a generation where the leaders themselves were being judged by others. And the example given, if somebody said, remove to the judge, or if the judge would say to somebody, remove the splinter from between your teeth, you have a blemish in the size of a toothpick, he would say back to the judge, take away the beam from between your eyes. Meaning, it's a time in which it's a kind of a metaphorical way of describing a generation in which the judges themselves were not of high moral character. That's the first statement that they make. The second is to identify Boaz with a shofet in the Book of Shoftim by the name of Ivtzan. They do this for the simple reason that Ivtzan is the only judge in the Book of Judges who comes from Bethlehem. Vayishpot acharav the pasuk in Perek Bet, Vayishpot acharav Yisrael Ivtzan mi Bethlehem. Vayilo 30 banim u30 banot. Of Ivtzan, it says that he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and he married 30 daughters to his sons. He married his sons to 30 daughters, and he had now 60 families. Why that is significant, I'll show you in a moment. Vayishpot et Yisrael sheva shanim. He judged Israel for 7 years. Vayamot Ivtzan vayikaver b'Beit Lachem, and he is buried in Beit Lechem. So the fact that he's in Beit Lechem, the fact that he is one of the judges in Beit Lechem, tells me, say Chazal, that Boaz and Yivtzan, here I want to be careful, are 2 points on a compass pointing to the same moment in time. Meaning, Chazal say that that Boaz is Yivtzan, but then they have to deal with these 30 sons and 30 daughters. And if you read the book of Shoftim, none of that's there. Right? There's no reference to these 30 sons and 30 daughters and 30 marriages and 30. Right? There's no reference to any of the story of Yivtzan in Megillat Ruth, any more than there's reference to the story of Ruth and Boaz in Sefer Shoftim. And so typically what these kinds of identifications do, like the suggestion of Eliyahu and Pinchas, is that they identify either a time frame or a personality connection. In this case, I think it's a time frame. So by placing Yivtzan and Boaz together, we're kind of narrowing in on, or zeroing in on, the time frame of this sefer. So what does that mean for us? So to do this, I really want to come back to the question of Dor Shofet Shoftav and try to understand what's going on in the book of Shoftim as a whole. You're getting sort of the 40-minute version of a course on the book of Shoftim, so I apologize if it's going fast, but I think it's important to understand what this book is about. This is a review, more or less, of all of the judges listed in the book of Shoftim. It's in the source page. I've just jumped. And what I've done is I've given you a list of all of the Shoftim as they appear in the book of Shoftim in order, together with their chapters. If you want to kind of spend a couple of weeks reviewing the book of Shoftim, here you have an opportunity. Here we have a map, if you will. Otniel ben Knaz, Ehud ben Gera, some of these names will be familiar to you, Devorah, Eshet Lapidot, Barak ben Avinoam. I've put them both here because Devorah in the book of Shoftim is described as a prophet, and Barak is really the general who leads them into battle. I would argue that Barak is the Shofet and Devorah is the Navi. Gidon ben Yoash is the story of the battle against Midian. Avimelech, who is the child of Gidon and a Pilegesh from Beit Shemesh, from Meshchem. Tola ben Puya, Ira Giladi, we'll talk about these in a moment. Yiftacha Giladi, and then Yivtzan of Beit Lechem, Elon Zvlani, Avdon ben Hillel, and finally Shimshon. Those are the judges listed by name and chapter. The other interesting piece of the story is years. Each one of them has a number of years where the Navi describes how long they reigned for, how long they ruled for, how long they led the people. Otniel ben Kenaz, 40 years. Ehud ben Gera, actually it says 80 years. But then by Shamgar ben Anat, it doesn't say anything. So the theory is maybe those 40 years include the 80 years, include the 40 for Shamgar. Devorah and Barak, 40 years. Gidon ben Yoash, 40 years. I think the pattern here is clear. What is the significance of 40 years? It's not an arbitrary fact that it can't be coincidence that 5 judges, one after the other, are each attributed a leadership role of 40 years. Right? Like Moshe in the desert, 40 Shana, Kut Bador, 40 years represents a kind of a generational leadership. And so their full generations, the influence of each one of them over the course of the people for a full generation of 40 years. From Avimelech to the Shimshon, you can see that the number of years each one led for sort of breaks down. There's no longer an influence of a generation. Now it's Avimelech 3 years, Tola ben Pua 23, 22, 6, 7, 10, 8, 20 years. Right now there's an arbitrary time of each judge, but there isn't a kind of holistic rounding context of the leadership of each generation. One could therefore argue that there's a certain positive attitude towards the influence, role, leadership of the first 5 judges, Otniel, Ehud, Devorah, Shamgar. We're going to, nothing much to say about them. There's one verse, Devorah, Barak, and Gidon. The remaining Shoftim, there's not much positive to say about any of them. If you've ever studied the book of Shoftim, you'll see Avimelech is a son of a Pilegesh. Avimelech tries to rule over the people of Shechem by force. Avimelech starts a civil war in the city of Shechem, and he ends up dying in that civil war after 3 years. Of Tola ben Puya irregular D, we don't know anything, more or less. I'll show you an exception. Jephthah, we have a great deal of stories, and a whole section of the stories about Jephthah. Of course, Jephthah is, you all know the story of Jephthah, right? Jephthah is a pagan, grew up amongst pagans. Jephthah was exiled from his people. Jephthah goes into battle against, we'll see who goes into battle against, but in the context of the story of Jephthah, he comes back home and he sacrifices his daughter on an altar as a kind of a pagan sacrifice, which is complicated and very Molech style, if you will, which isn't surprising considering the fact that his battle was against the people of Ammon, and the deity of Ammon, funnily enough, is Molech. So it's just an interesting observation. Ivtzana bet Lechem, I showed you a couple of psukim. We don't know much about them. These we call these Tola, Yair, Ivtzan, Elon, and Avdon. We call them the minor Shoftim, not because they're less significant, but because we know nothing about them. There's 2 or 3 psukim that they existed. They had a bunch of sons. They had a bunch of cities they ruled over, and then we moved on. So the only 2 stories in this half of the chart that are of significance are the 2 chapters related to Jephthah and the 3 chapters or 4 chapters related to Shimshon. Okay? So even if I was looking at it just schematically, and I was trying to pinpoint, okay, where am I looking for the low point, the nadir, the place where the leadership is failing them on the most significant level, any one of these on the left side would qualify, but we need to pin it down a little bit more. And so Chazal said, okay, Bet Lechem, Ivtzan, Bet Lechem, Boaz, maybe that's where we're at, but I think it's much deeper than that, and that's what I wanted to show you. Quick understanding of the story of Shoftim. So if we go back to Shoftim Perek Bet, so for everybody with me, if I'm going too fast, just somebody stop me because I'm kind of. If we go back to the story of Shoftim in Perek Bet, there is an introduction. Shoftim is one of the most structured books in Tanakh. It's fascinating. And there is a clear introduction to the whole context of Shoftim. And it starts with the following. Israel did evil in the eyes of God. They served Baal. Who is Baal? Baal is a deity, a fertility god. The Canaanites worshipped. Usually fertility gods come in pairs, male, female pairs. Baal is the male, Ashtoreth or Asherah is the female. It's a fertility god. It's also the god of rain. We think Eliyahu and Har Carmel, where there's no rain, and they're crying out to the prophets of Baal, and showed them with the prophets of Baal. Classic Canaanite deity, because you're totally dependent upon the rain in the land of Israel, and so that is the deity that they served. They abandoned God and took him out of Egypt. And they worshiped Baal and his consort. God was angry, and he handed them over to plunderers, and they would plunder them. And he would hand them over to their enemies, all the enemies around them. And they could not stand before their enemies. They would be threatened. There would be an existential crisis. And God would punish them. Finally, they would cry out. God, they were greatly distressed. So God enabled judges, Shoftim, to rise up, who saved them from the hands of their plunderers. And they eventually didn't listen to the Shoftim either and continued this cycle in the next generation. And so God was with They were with God. God was with the judges all the days that the judge led. But when the Shofet died, they would return to their evil ways. Yeshuva v'shchita mi'avotam. They would go and they would be even worse than their fathers. Not only were they worse because they repeated their sin, but the sin itself would get worse, and therefore God would be angry at them, and this cycle would repeat itself. And more or less in those verses, we have the summary of the entire structure of the book of Shoftim. To put it in simple terms, 400 years of a cycle of the people being loyal to God, abandoning that loyalty, worshiping other gods or other nations, being influenced by other forces, God responding by giving them an existential threat of what the Navi describes, shosehem, or shosim, or oivim, enemies around them, nations around them, Aram, Ammon, Moab, Midian, Bnei Kedem, Plishtim, right? Oh, we're familiar with all of these names. And eventually, out of their distress, they would either cry out to God, or that God would have compassion, and they would be saved in the hands of a shofet. Let me talk for a minute about the concept of a shofet. What is a shofet? So here's where there is a misnomer or a mistranslation, if you will. I've often thought that I heard this once from Rabbi Ben. The word shofet in the book of Shoftim is very different than the word shofet in the Torah. The Torah talks about judges as a judicial role, right? Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sharecha. To place judges and magistrates and officers in each of your gates. It's a court, much analogous to the Sanhedrin. Members of the Sanhedrin, members of the court, judges in the court of judges, never go to war. They don't fight on the battlefield. Who fights on the battlefield? Who leads an army into battle? Kings lead an army into battle. Judges sit in the courts. The role of a shofet in the book of Shoftim is not analogous to a judicial role at all. In fact, it's much more analogous to a political leader or a military leader who would lead the people in battle against their enemies. And every one of the Shoftim that we looked at just a moment ago, right, that's exactly the story. The story is their battle against their enemies as they would lead. So the closest definition of a shofet in the book of Shoftim is a tribal leader. In other words, the shofet is much more analogous to a melech than he is to a judge in a judicial sense. In the Torah, the concept of a shofet in the description that I'm giving you now would be called a nasi. Meaning in the Torah you have the Navi and you have judges, and then you have the Nasi of each Shevet, who's the leader of each Shevet. In the book of Shoftim, you had Shoftim from each Shevet. Chazal make a very interesting observation, which is that, and I'll show you this map, this is a list of all of the Shoftim in the book of Shoftim and where they're from. And what you get a sense from the white boxes, not the colors are the tribes. The white boxes, the names of each shofet as they appear in the book. The reason some are underlined is because we have stories about them. The ones that are not underlined, we don't know much about them. Those are the minor shoftim. But what you get is a sense that they're disseminated throughout the land. And that's exactly the point. A shofet in the book of Shoftim is analogous to a leader like a melech, military leader, a charismatic leader, political leader, / tribal, regional. And that's part of the challenge of this period of time, is that as the regional leadership breaks down and the people's cohesion as a nation breaks down, you end up with a need for a national leadership, and that's the primary message of the book of Shoftim. The notion that without national leadership, this form of leadership is going to fail in bringing the people together in any kind of cohesive religious direction. The whole period of the book of Shoftim highlights that message, and therefore it ends with two stories, which you may have heard of, Pelagish Begiva, Idol Pesamicha, which are really about the breakdown of this structured, of this kind of regional leadership, need for bringing the people together as a national leadership, and that leads to the book of Shmuel and the end of Shoftim, the beginning of Malchus. Okay, that's more or less the structure of this story. Okay. But in the iterations that we have in this description of the introduction, each generation gets worse. And so what I'm really looking for, if I go back to the phrase, Dor sheshofet et shoftav, I'm looking for what's the low point? Where is the consideration that this is the lowest point we have in the story? So let me share with you a simple chart. And the simple chart is a introduction or the description of the chet, the sin, and the punishment for each one of these shoftim. And we can kind of see from there if we can pinpoint the low point of the book. Everybody see where I'm trying to go? We're good? All right. So I made this chart once, which is, and I apologize, it's all in Hebrew. I'm going to translate as we go. All you really need to see in this is the schematic of what I call the column inches, the number of words devoted to each one. That in itself tells you the story. Okay, and these are the 5 major judges in advance. I didn't put Shimshon into this chart for a reason I'll show you in a moment. But we start with Otniel ben Knaz, Ehud ben Gera, Devorah and Barak, Gidon, Jephthah. Who have I left out? I've left out all the minor judges. Because all we're told about the minor judges is that they had many sons, many daughters, and ruled over many cities. So we don't really have a lot of information there. But if I come to this, sorry, too many tabs open. I come to this chart, and let's take a look. Otniel ben Knaz. This first column is a description of the chet, of the sin. Vayasu b'nei Yisrael tara b'nei Hashem, vayishkechu et Hashem Elokahem, vayavdu et ha'ba'alim ve'et ha'asherot. Israel abandoned God, they forgot God, and they worshipped Baal and Ashtoreth or Asherah, which is exactly what I described to you back in chapter 2. Vayichra af Hashem b'Yisrael. And God was angry at Israel. What did he do? Vayimkerem biyad Kushan risha'atayim melech Aram Narai. He sold them to the hands of Kushan Rishatayim. Interesting name, Kushan, the double evil one. Just interesting name by itself. King of Aram, up north. Vayavdu b'nei Yisrael et Kushan Rishatayim shmona shanim. So it tells us that they served Kushan Rishatayim for 8 years. And then if I looked at the text, you would see Vayakom Hashem Hoshea, God appointed for them or enabled to rise up from them a leader by the name of Otniel ben Knaz, and he leads them into battle against Kushan Rishatayim, they're victorious, and the land was quiet for 40 years. More or less, that's the story of Otniel. Ehud ben Gera. Vayasifu b'nei Yisrael lasot hara b'nei Hashem. They, again, did evil in the eyes of God. So what did God do? He strengthened the hand of Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel because of Israel's sins. And Eglon, melech Moab, and he gathered together the people of Ammon and Amalek together so that there's a kind of a unity forces of Moab, Ammon, and Amalek, typically the 3 that go together. And they smote Israel and they conquered Ir HaTmarim. What is Ir HaTmarim? Yericho. Which is interesting because what it's telling you is, just to look at this on a map for a moment, what it's telling you, here is Ammon, here is Moab, here is Bnei Kedem, down here in the south, and it tells you that they're encroaching through this bridge into Yericho, that means they're cutting across the territory of Reuven and Gad, and that's not necessarily good for us overall. And that is Vayavdu b'nei Yisrael et Eglon melech Moab shmones shana. They served Moab for 18 years, meaning that for those 18 years, they were subjects of Moab. Ammon and Bnei Ketan, they ruled the land. Or in some sense, there's no national leadership, so it means that they felt the oppression of them, and ultimately the story of Ehud ben Gera, I'm not going to review. You know the story. Ehud, Eglon Melech Moab was very fat. Ehud has a concealed weapon because he's left-handed, and so he pulls his weapon out of a hidden sheath, and he stabs Ehud up close, and as they say, the rest of the story is not pleasant. Then you have the story of Devar and Barak, which is chapter 4 and 5, which is, of course, includes the Shira. And this is now iteration number 3. Vayasifu b'nei Yisrael asot hara b'nei Hashem. They did evil in the eyes of God. Vayimkerem b'yad Yavin melech Canaan. Sold him into the hands of Yavin melech Canaan. Sartz v'os Sisra. He was king of Chatzor, and his general was Sisra. And he was in Emek Yisrael with 900 chariots. Sitting in Emek Yisrael with 900 chariots, you know that is not good. Emek Yisrael is here, and Emek Yisrael is a critical path for the trade routes to the land of Israel. To control this region here with 900 chariots, trouble. Okay? He pressed this over 20 years until Devorah sends a message to Barak, and she says, "Let's go. Let's deal with this." And Barak says, "Only if you come with me." All right, great miracle, great victory, great song. We move on. Gidon. Ve'yasu b'nei Yisrael hara b'nei Hashem. They did evil in the eyes of God. Notice the description of the Chet in all 4 of these instances. Okay, the description of the Chet in all 4 of these instances is more or less the same. The level of the oppression gets a little bit worse, but because they've repeated the offense, but more or less you have a similar kind of offense. So God strengthened the hand of Midian against Israel. Because of Midian, they made all kinds of tunnels and caves and places to hide their food. Why do they have to hide their food? Because if they would bring bread, if they would bring wheat, if they would grow crops, what would happen? Midian, Amalek, and Bnei Kedan would come and storm through the land, and they would they would encamp against them, and they would destroy all of the produce of the land and take it with them until they were left with nothing. They, together with the cattle and their tents, they were all nomadic. You notice Midian, Bnei Kedan, all nomadic tribes, and so they would come together with their tents, and they would end up Vayidal Yisrael Me'od Vayitnem B'yad Hashem B'yad Midian Sheva Shanim. They impoverished Israel. Interesting phrase, right? Now we've moved from lachatz, from pressure, to impoverished them because they kept stealing their produce. That's Gidon. And then we come to Yiftach. And remember, after Yiftach, there's just Shimshon. All the other ones are just minor prophets. We come to Yiftach. That phrase in itself, they again did evil in the eyes of God, is exactly the same as we had before. But now we have a much bigger description. Vayavdu et habe'alim et ashtarot. They worship the Baal and Ashtoreth, and Ve'etalei Aram, and the gods of Sidon, and the gods of Moab, and the gods of Ammon, and the gods of the Plishtim. V'yazu Hashem v'lo avadu. They abandoned God and did not serve him. This description of the Chet is significantly different than all of the previous iterations. And it's different because what you basically have is a description of a total breakdown of any kind of religious center cohesion. Right? we're not describing a situation where one Israelite would worship the gods of Aram on Sunday and the gods of Sidon on Monday and the gods of Moab on Tuesday and the gods of Ammon on Wednesday, and you have a pantheon of churches. That's not the issue. What you have is a total breakdown of region. Those in the south are being influenced by the Plishtim. Those in the east are being influenced by Moab or Ammon. Those in the north are being influenced by Sidon or by Aram. And there is the sense of Israelite identity, spiritually, religiously, is being totally eroded. And so we get to the description of the punishment. And for the sake of making this easier for you, I'm going to jump here, but you can see already there's a much longer piece of text here. I'm going to jump that piece of text in the book itself, and we're going to shift our attention to chapter 10. Oh my goodness. Okay. Starting with Pasuk Vav. They continued, and I described, this is the description of the Pasuk I just shared with you. God gave them to the hands of two, the hands of the Plishtim and the hands of the Ammon. Now, a word about that phrase, it would seem, hang on one second, it would seem that what we're describing is the introduction to Jephthah, which has them fighting against Ammon, also seems to have a reference to the Plishtim down south. And so most of the Mefarshim suggest that this introduction that we're reading now is an introduction to two Shoftim, Jephthah and Shimshon. Shimshon is in the south. Shimshon will deal with the Plishtim. We don't have an introduction to Shimshon. This introduction serves both because, and without getting into the chronology of the book too much, more or less, Jephthah and Shimshon are most likely contemporary. Jephthah in the east, Shimshon in the south, and so our introduction has reached a point where we're introducing both. God sent them in the hands of the Plishtim to be in the hands of Ammon. We're going to focus on Ammon. He'll deal with the Plishtim. You follow what I'm suggesting? That is a, okay. They distress and oppress the people of Israel for 18 years. All the people of Israel on the other side of the Jordan. In the land of the Amorites, which is in the Gilad. Then the Ammon crossed over the Yarden. Not only did they conquer the areas of Reuben and Gad, Israel was greatly distressed. And the people cried out to God, and they said, we've sinned, we've abandoned God, and we've worshipped Baal. And God said to them, for all of these years, you've been oppressed by various people, Mitzrayim, Emor, Ammon, Plishtim, Sidon, Amalek. But you cried out to me and I saved you. But then you just abandoned me again. And you worshipped other gods. I'm done. I'm not going to save you anymore. Go cry to the gods you've chosen. Let them save you. We have not encountered that before. That is new. That is absolutely a crisis moment. They cried out to God, and God said no. God, do whatever you please in your eyes, but save us this day. And so, Bnei Ammon is pressing. This is the story now of Bnei Ammon. We'll deal with Shimshon and the Plishtim in Parakid Gimel. But for now, Bnei Ammon is pressing. So they turned and they said, who is going to fight against Bnei Ammon? And lo and behold, who do they find? Jephthah HaGiladi. And from every vantage point, we have reached what I would argue is the low point of Megillat, of Sefer Shoftim. And when Chazal say Dosh Shaftu Shaftav, your criteria amongst the choices of Otniel Ben Gnaz, Eir Ben Geret, Dvorah, Gidon, Yiftach, or Shimshon, I think Yiftach takes the cake. Could argue Shimshon, maybe. I would argue Yiftach is worse. Any person who sacrifices his daughter on the altar of Molech after fighting against Ammon is complicated, and I think that is really the low point of Sefer Shoftim. And so, if I had to pinpoint what Dorshe Shoftu et Shoftav means, I don't think we'd have a hard time defending the position that we're talking about, the time frame of Yiftach. Okay, that's part one. Part two is, if I look at this map, this is a map of how many years we have a description of Shibud, of each of these enemies prior to the Shofet leading them in battle. Kushan Rishatayim for 8 years, Eglah Melech for 18 years, Plishtim, Yavin, etc. 18 years they're under the oppression of Ammon, prior to the role of Yiftach and the war Yiftach has to save the people. When Chazal then say that when Naomi returns to Beit Lechem, she returns to Beit Lechem in the days of Ivtzan, because Ivtzan is the only Shofet in the book of Shoftim who comes from Beit Lechem, Chazal are now further pinpointing the story of when Elimelech leaves, because if when Elimelech returns, Ivtzan is sitting in Beit Lechem, how many years earlier did Elimelech go to Moab? 10. Which more or less would put us, jump to the time period before Yiftach, because Yiftach is really only 6 years. If I'm looking from Ivtzan backwards 10 years, I'm going back into the world of the 18 years of oppression at the hands of Ammon. Does everybody understand the chronology that I've just identified? That's a critical piece. Now, it's Chazal do two things. They say, okay, Dor Shishoftu et Shoftav is can't get better or worse than Yiftach. But 10 years prior to their return to Ivtzan of Beit Lechem / time period of Boaz would put them in the years prior to Yiftach, in the years of the end of these 18 years of oppression of Ammon. Well, if that's true, then what I really need to understand is, how does this oppression at the hands of Ammon relate to our story of Elimelech going to Moab? Again, here's your map. Elimelech in Beit Lechem, when there's a Ra'av, goes to Moab. But Yiftach, with the 18 years of oppression, are in the hands of Ammon. And Yiftach fights Ammon. Ammon's up here, Moab is down here. What do they have to do with each other? So far, we're with me? All right. So here we're going to do a little experiment. We're going to read the beginning of the conversation between Yiftach and the king of Ammon. King of Ammon. The war starts. King of Ammon is now sitting King of Ammon is now sitting here in the after he conquered Reuven and Gad and the Gilad, and he's sitting in Ephraim and Binyamin and Yehuda, and Yiftach Hagiladi comes to the Gilad. Yiftach comes together to fight against Ammon. Okay, here's your, sorry, too many tabs open. So let's jump to that conversation. Vayishlach Yiftach malachim el melech b'nei Ammon lim. Yiftach sent a delegation to the king of Ammon. And that delegation he sent us a question. He says, what business do you have to come to fight in my land? The king of Ammon says to the messengers of Yiftach, I'm here because Israel took my land when they left Mitzrayim. And so I'm here to reclaim my land. What's my land? Me'arnon ve'ad hayabok ve'ad hayarden. From the Arnon to the Yabok River to the Yarden. Okay, here's your map. Here is the Arnon River. southern flank of Reuven. Here is the Abok River, northern flank of Gad. This territory here, which we had conquered from Sichon, Amorite king, if you remember in Parshat Chukat, comes on King of Ammon and says, I'm here to claim my territory from the Arnon to the Abok. Okay. So Yiftach responds, Vayosef od Yiftach, and he gives Melech Bnei Ammon a history lesson. Vayomelo, Kama Yiftach. What are you talking about? Lo lakachet Eretz Moav ve'et Eretz Bnei Ammon. Israel didn't take the land of Moab and Ammon. Right here, I'm going to stop for a second. What's wrong with this verse? What's wrong with this verse? Oops, sorry, I can't hide like this. Somebody want to tell me what's wrong with this verse?
Where did Moab come from?
Where did Moab come from? He's talking to the king of Ammon. Okay, keep that question in mind. When they left Egypt 300 years earlier, they came to Kadesh. We sent a message and delegation to King of Edom to go in your land, and Edom didn't listen. And we also sent messages to Moab, and he didn't let us go through either. And so we went around Moab. We didn't go through Moab. Yiftach, you're talking to the king of Ammon. We went all the way around the land of Edom and around the land of Moab. We came eastward of the land of Moab. We never touched the gvul of Moab. Arnon was the border of Moab. Just take a look at the map. This is a map of the story in Bamidbar Perchav Aleph. We came up here and we went around, and we came around the land of Moab because we weren't allowed to go through. So we came up here, and over there in Yatzah, they came out to fight with us. We went to Sichon. We said to Sichon, we want to go through your land. Sichon was a Canaanite king. It wasn't Emor. He wasn't Moab. He wasn't Ammon. Sichon. This was land that Sichon was sitting in, and we fought with Sichon. God gave us the land of Sichon. The land was taken from the Amorites, not from the Moabites, even though we're talking to the king of Ammon, and I'm confused. Now he says, okay, you don't like that argument? I'll give you a different argument. I'll give you a theological argument. God of Israel caused us to take the land from Sichon. The land that you have been given by Kmosh, your God, that land you can have. But the land given to us by God will take. Meaning, this is a theological argument. You have your God, we have our God. Our God has enabled us to conquer this land. Your deity, named Kmosh, has not. Now, I have a problem with that verse. What's my problem? You just have to know the facts. Kmosh is not the deity of Ammon. I said to you before, what is the name of the deity of Ammon? Molech. Kmosh shikutz Moav, umolech shikutz bnei Ammon. Kmosh is the deity of Moab. Molech is the deity of Ammon. And that's consistent. Kmosh Elohim Moab u'mokom Elohim bnei Ammon. Oy lecha Moab v'avadat am Kmosh. Kmosh is the deity of Moab, not Ammon. Yiftach, you're talking to the wrong king. You're talking to the king of Ammon, and you're talking about Kmosh. And then, just to add insult to injury, he throws in Balak. Are you any better than the last king of Moab who tried to take the land from us, whose name is Balak? And the cities of Cheshbon and Aroer and all of these cities between the Arnon and the Abok, why I've been ours for 300 years. Where were you for the last 300 years? But he's talking to the king of Ammon, and every argument he makes is against the king of Moab. What's the answer? Simple. What's the answer? In the book of Shoftim, Ammon and Moab are one people. They're cousins. When Ehud went to war against Eglon, Melech Moab, he had gathered together in his campaign the king of Ammon and the king of Edom. Ammon and Moab are never separated in the book of Shoftim. In Sefer Malachim, they're separate. They have different gods, they have different cultures, they have different arenas. But in Shoftim, for the 400 years of the book of Shoftim, Ammon and Moab, for all intents and purposes, are one people. He's talking to the king of Ammon, and he's arguing with the king of Moab. It's the same region, same people. Okay. Which means that in the 10 years prior, where's my map? Which one am I looking for? Here we go. In the 10 years prior to Yiftach, prior to Iftzan, jump ahead of Yiftach, we end up in the 18 years of the oppression of Ammon/Moab. All right. If you accept that chiddush, or that novelty, that idea, which appears in the footnote of Midan Sefer, accept that, then more or less, the story now takes on a whole different context. Because I asked the question at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of our study, if there's a famine in Bethlehem, why on earth are they going to Moab? There's no rain in Moab any more than there is in Bethlehem. Unless a famine can be caused by more than one phenomena. Famine can be caused by drought, rain, lack of. But if I go back to the book of Shoftim, we already saw in the time of Midian, where's that chart? Sorry, I'm just going to look for that. Yeah, we already saw in the time of Midian, Vayidal Yisrael Mod Mifnei Midian, that Midian would come and take all their food. And so they were greatly impoverished. There's even a quote in the book of Nehemiah that describes 500 years later, they're back in the land of Israel after the Churban in the days of Persia oppression. And in Nehemiah, he describes a situation where they're living in the land of Israel, but they're ruled by Persia. And how does that description happen? And what's described there? He says, we are slaves in our land. And all of our produce is being taken by the kings, by the nations that have come against us and that are ruling over us. And over our bodies they rule, and our land and our cattle they take, and we're greatly distressed. It can be much a function of conquest as it can of drought. If that's true, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. If that's true, then I have a whole different context of the book of Shoftim. Because when Elimelech takes his family from Bethlehem and he goes to Sdei Moab because there's a famine in the land, he's not going to Moab because there's rain in Moab. Again, put the context of the story together. If he's 10 years before Yiftzan, he's in the 3 years prior to Yiftach. Who are they at war with in that period of time? Ammon/Moab. Elimelech doesn't go to Moab because there's rain in Moab. He goes to Moab because at that moment in time for the last 15 years, Moab is the winning side in the war against Israel. He goes to Moab because there's food in Moab. There's food in Moab, not because there's a drought. There's food in Moab because they're winning the war and Israel is losing the war. And there's a drought in the land of Israel because they're at war with Moab for 18 years. Elimelech didn't turn his back on his people. Elimelech was a traitor. Elimelech went over to the side of the enemy. For 18 years, they're at war with Ammon and Moab. Now suddenly the whole story takes on a different character. because God punishes Elimelech and he kills Elimelech. And what do the two sons of Elimelech do? Machlon and Chilion? They marry Moabite daughters, and they ingratiate themselves to the people of Moab. 10 years later, we're now post Jephthah. 10 years later, we're post Jephthah. Ki shema b'stei Moab, ki fakad Hashem et amo latet lehem lachem. Naomi hears in the fields of Moab, in the land of Moab, that God had heard his people, answered his people, remembered his people to give them bread. AKA, post Yiftach, the war is over. The battle has been won. Ammon and Moab have been pushed back. And now Bethlehem is beginning to reassert themselves. Elimelech goes to the land of the enemy. When Chazal say he pil liban Yisrael, that he disheartened the people of Israel, he didn't dishearten them because he was stingy and he didn't want to give them tzedakah. He was a traitor. Now, on that basis, I've run out of time, but on that basis, work the story backwards. When Naomi comes back to Bethlehem, who does she have in tow? Ruth HaMoaviyah. Ruth HaMoaviyah. And if you pay careful attention, as we're going to see through the text now of the next couple of weeks, every reference to Ruth in the book up until the time Boaz takes her, every reference to Ruth is Ruth HaMoaviyah. And yes, Chazal build this whole theory about the fact that they're not allowed to take converts from Moab, and so the male converts and female converts, but on the sociological level, it's much deeper. The issue of Ruth is not that she's a convert. The issue of Ruth is that she comes from the people of the enemy. They've been at war with Ammon and Moab for 18 years. And now post Yiftach, they come back. How dare Naomi show her face in Bethlehem? How dare she come back? Hazot Naomi? She was a traitor. She was married to Elimelech. She abandoned us. She went to Moab. They stand there and they go, you have the audacity to come back here? Not with a Moabite in tow? Now the whole story takes on a different tenor. And as we read through the story, we read the conflict, with the tension with the people of Bethlehem, you understand, if we process that she is a Moabite, then suddenly Boaz becomes a much greater personality. Ruth becomes a much greater personality. And the story takes on a whole different level. That's the historical context. If you prefer the famine drought interpretation, that's last week's presentation. If you prefer I am biased to this interpretation, that Elimelech is in fact, as a person of stature and significance, chooses, imagine, you can just put it into modern context. You don't need to use your imagination much to figure it out, right? Imagine a leader of one of the cities of Israel picking themselves up and going and planting themselves in the heartland of a land of our enemy. Unfortunately, we see sometimes people with long beards and black coats doing that in today's world, in the Turk art, right? That's the problem. In Megillat Ruth, that's exactly the issue. And now to marry them and to bring them back, nobody's prepared to talk to Naomi. Nobody's prepared to engage with Naomi. They consider her a traitor. Until you get to the depth of the story of Ruth and Boaz, then already the story has a whole new interpretation, a whole new meaning. And Boaz really emerges to the as the hero of the story, Ruth and Boaz. All right. With that,
can I just say one thing?
Questions? Yes, by all means.
I'm always afraid that I'll miss next week or something. For the longest time, I felt that when Naomi is noticed and people are going, could that be her? And she said, call me Mara and not Naomi. And I look at Mara as Mary, meaning merit, meaning now I'm a rebel. I've rebelled against my husband. So now with what you said, you've given more to this, because I've rebelled against what my husband did. And Nomi means, somebody easygoing. No more Miss Nice Guy, Miss
Yeah,
Nice Girl.
I hear what you're trying to
It's
do.
like I'm now being independent.
Right.
I'm now
I,
doing.
I hear what you're saying. I disagree on the interpretation of the word mara, because mara and ana is a reference to her bitterness against God. Hashem anavi, God has been cruel to me. God has punished me. Chronology mara ki shad hemar li meod. God is greatly bitter to me. The focus is on the bitterness she has felt at the hand of God. Now, she's felt the hand of God because she's felt the wrath of God against the family. Right? She didn't have a choice. She went with Elimelech, because in the world of Tanakh, the wife goes where the husband goes. Right? It's
Yeah, so
yeah.
so that's why she said, "I'm a rebel. I went against my will. This is it.
Yeah, I don't think
No
she's.
more.
I don't see the word
I'm
Marad
not.
there as for
You
merit,
can't."
but I hear what you're saying. I think Marad there comes from bitter, from Mahor, but I don't see the Dalit
Um,
not there.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
How can you immerse yourself in the land of your enemy? I don't
If you're
know
a trader,
how.
you can.
What?
Well, it's called picking the winning side. 18 years,
No, but
Moab has been the winning side.
I know that. But why would they accept him?
Because, are you kidding? With open arms, they gave him a ticker tape parade. The leader of the people of Beit Lechem comes and joins
Oh,
our side of the campaign. They
oh.
gave him a ticker tape parade. They embraced him with honors. I have no doubt. He was a
Rabbi,
symbol of their victory.
Rabbi, David did that with the push team when he was running from
Correct.
Saul.
But David did it with the Plishtim because he had no choice, and
Right.
you see the struggle he
Right,
had.
and they accepted him.
Yeah, it took a while to convince them, but they did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the daughters that they married were of royalty. So
unfortunately,
I'm surprised.
there is a medrash to that effect. It doesn't say so in the text. We don't have any information in the text
Oh.
as to Ruth or Paz lineage. But I'm not surprised that they would marry royalty, meaning that's part of this midrashic interpretation that says that they were traders and they went to the people of Moab and they embraced Moab and Moab embraced them. And if they're at war with Moab, it suddenly takes on a whole new meaning.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. It's very interesting.
Rabbi, thank you for, this lecture. But I have maybe a little off topic, but something on my mind. Who was the shofet when in the Pelegish story?
There is no shofet in the Pelegish story.
There was none.
That's why the Pelegish story begins with the phrase "Beimimahem ein melech b'Yisrael ish kol yashav beinav yaseh."
There was none.
There was none. There's some question as to whether that means there was no king or no shofet, but there is no shofet listed or mentioned in that story.
Okay, thank you.
Correct.
Rabbi,
Yes.
but looking at your maps, the topography is that Moab is the start of the mountains. So if the rain comes from east to west, before it has to go up the mountains or the hills, it drops off. So there is a difference in topography because you have that whole mountain range between Moab and Israel. We know with the Rockies that works that way. When it comes from the middle of the continent, it drops the rain.
The same mountain ranges are in Reuven and Gad. So he goes to Moab instead of Reuven and Gad? I don't see it.
It's a quicker walk. He
Lechem?
goes across.
From Beit Lechem to go to Moab is faster than to go to Reuven? I don't see it. If he's just looking for topography, then go to Reuven or go to Gad. Go. There's lots of places with water. Here's the Jordan River. You want to go to the Arnon trickle of the Arnon River, the Yabok River, when you can go to the Jordan River. You've got Reuven and Gad over here. You're going to go all the way down to Moab.
Well, where do the winds come from? I'm not sure that I can't assume that they go to all three kingdoms.
You can make the argument that it's rain. I can't see it.
Mm.
And there's no reference to it. So I don't see it.
Now, I'm going to defend him because he has my father's name. So I'm going to defend this. I'll be perfectly honest with you. There's a lot of speculation there because, that's why I prefer last week's to this week's. But
I'm gonna push back only a little bit because and this comes back to the broader question. The more we justify Elimelech's decision and behavior, the more we end up criticizing God. Because at the end of the day, God punishes him for it. God chases after him, God punishes him, he kills him, and he kills his 2 sons. So you can defend Elimelech, but that would critique God. Or you could defend God and critique Elimelech.
I
Take
could
your choice.
also go back to your previous series where sometimes we don't critique God enough. And the Hasidim are very good at that.
Not in Megillat Ruth. I hear that,
But the
I
other
don't see it.
question I have is if you're gonna judge people by the shofet, so you're saying that the guy who killed his daughter or exiled her was the worst.
Right.
So does that
Right.
mean that the greatest generation was Moses's because he was the greatest leader?
No. I'm just trying to identify how Chazal saw the book of Shoftim. Chazal saw the book of Shoftim not as a circle, but as a spiral.
Mm.
And so that's exactly the phrase. Dor sheshofet et shoftav means in the book of Shoftim, each generation is getting worse. All that they've done, however, is they've stopped at Yiftach only because that introduction to Yiftach is also the introduction to Shimshon. So I've reached the last point of time in the book of Shoftim. And
But
that's
if
the
you're
bottom.
if you're judging that way, first of all, if they get worse, so they're less culpable because the examples they had were that way. And if you're judging by the worst atrocities, if you go back through Jewish history when the worst atrocities were, I'm not sure that they were the worst generations.
Oh my
So
goodness.
whether
I'm
it
not talking
was
about the worst atrocities.
No.
I'm talking about, again, back up one step. All I said is Chazal are trying to understand when the story took place. This is the hint. There's a message in the book of Shoftim. I'm not extrapolating from the book of Shoftim to other periods of history, etc. I'm just saying, in the context of the book of Shoftim, the story is clear. You can read it through the whole book. That every iteration, the leadership of the generation gets weaker spiritually. Gideon, who wants to be a king, and they want him made to be a king, and he says, "No, I don't want to be a king. I want God as your king." And then he makes an idol out of the gold that he picked up from Midian. Avimelech is Avimelech's son, who goes and he kills half of the people of Shem because he wants to be king. One generation, the next 4 kings, the next 5 Shoftim, the next 5 Shoftim, which we didn't read, but each one of them tells me they had 30 sons or 30 daughters or 30 Pilakshim ruling over this city and that city, ruling over. They're trying to establish monarchy in a time when monarchy is premature. Yiftach, whose story is about the sacrifice of a daughter. Shimshon, of all people.
He
I'm not
did it
going
on
to
his
defend
own.
Shimshon. I'm not going to defend Shimshon on any level. All I'm saying is that in the context of the book of Shoftim, the message was that there's a spiraling degradation of the spiritual depth of the leadership. Hence, Shtor Sheshofet Shoftav. That's all I'm saying. And that tells me the time frame of the story of Elimelech.
I have a different question.
Yes.
Your assumption is that Ruth and Naomi came back at the beginning of the time of Boaz.
Correct.
If you had the 6 years or 7 years of Boaz, then the 10 years come up in the middle of Yiftach.
Correct. But again, I'm assuming again, Chazal take that analysis between Iftzan and Boaz to the nth degree, and they, literally, and they say, okay, well, Boaz marries Ruth, so all those other children must have, all of the wives that he had, they had to have died on that day. Again, the Medrash and the Gemara Baba Basra goes to a very different direction. All I'm suggesting is that Midrashim like that are designed to give us a direction and not to be taken literally. And in a direction, what it tells me is, here's the timetable, here's the time frame. You want to say they came back in the middle of the time of Yiftach, or that they left in the middle of the time of Yiftach? Maybe they left because of the war. Maybe they thought that the war was not going well. Again, we don't know. But I'm much more inclined to say that Boaz is not identified with Iftzan, but at the same time as Iftzan. That's more my understanding, and that would put the 10 years into the battle with Moab. It just makes much more sense in the context of the story. All right, I'm going to have to stop here, but I appreciate your time, your patience, and your
Thank you.
10 minutes. And Bezrat Hashem, we've now unfortunately pushed our schedule off, so all of the topics that we had advertised are now going to be delayed 1 week. Next week, we'll deal with the question of Ruth's conversion, which is the rest of chapter 1. And what I do with that extra class that I had scheduled at the end, I will figure out what to do with it. And but for now, we will continue next week with the story of Ruth. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank
Well,
you.
beat
Rabbi.
things up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
My
Very
pleasure.
well.
Okay.